Last year, we had a look into some of Hasan's takes on the war in Ukraine, many of which were described as ill-informed, ideologically distorted, and not good. We focused a lot on his thought process and how it leads him to consistently believe disinformation and weak analysis, and you know what? You can just watch the video. F off. Anyway, now that it's been over a year, I thought it would be worth checking in on his more recent takes on the war, and here's what I found. In a recent conversation with Marianne Williamson, they discussed the prospect of a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine. And here's what Hasan had to say.
I think some people talk very simplistically about what it means to call a ceasefire. The United States does not have the power to just walk in there and say, hey guys, stop, okay? If you were simply to, if the West were simply to withhold all aid at this point, military aid, then the peace would not be the result. It would simply be the avenue by which Putin would crush Ukraine. So no, I'm not on with that. I would like to see it be a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine has any Ukraine to negotiate.
Well, there was a 15-point plan negotiated in Turkey in the earlier version of the invasion that seemingly was a little bit more prosperous. Zelensky himself even conceded to pushing Crimea later down, to like a 15-year program for Crimea, where he would like have another democratic vote on how to best continue on with those negotiations. That all fell apart when Boris Johnson visited Ukraine, and I don't think that England has any sort of agency in this conversation beyond operating as a mouthpiece for the American State Department.
And then there's that interview with Naftali Bennett and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think you have to excuse the United States to stand for the sovereignty of Ukraine.
So, to summarize, what we have here is 1. Early on in the war, there was a 15-point peace plan which seemed to offer some promise, with both Putin and Zelensky showing signs of approval. And 2. Those negotiations fell apart when Boris Johnson visited Ukraine. Now, maybe your intuition is telling you that this sounds a little dubious, but bear in mind, this is a take coming from the largest political streamer on earth, and he's saying it to someone who is aspiring to be the president of the United States. So, if we're going to challenge this, we need a bit more than intuition. We need facts. Straight facts. So, let's get into it. The origin of this claim about Boris came from an article by an outlet called Ukrainian Pravda. In it, they argue that in the beginning of April, just over 6 weeks into the war, the Russian side was ready for a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Until, without warning, Boris Johnson appeared in Kyiv and said, Putin is a war criminal. He should be suppressed, not negotiated with. And secondly, if you are ready to sign any agreements on guarantees with him, then we are not. We can with you, but not with him. He will abandon everyone. Throughout the rest of the month, officials from Austria and the United Nations held meetings with Putin, both indicating that there was little hope of the two sides coming to an agreement. By May, it had more or less become conventional wisdom that a diplomatic solution was out of the question. So, was this in any way the fault of Boris Johnson? Well, it's tempting to say that. Everyone hates Boris Johnson. If there was ever a politician so horrible that he would literally prolong a war just to fulfill his childhood fantasies of being a modern-day Winston Churchill, it's definitely this guy. But it might be a little short-sighted to take one statement from a period where quite a lot of dialogue was happening and just conclude that things were looking promising, Boris disagreed, and then everything stopped. Because it turns out there were several talks between Russians and Ukrainians at the start of the war, and not everyone has the same opinion on why they ultimately failed. Clearly, some people are blaming Boris, but not everyone. And as we're going through this, for the sake of audience participation, it might be a good idea for you guys watching to try and figure out at what stage of these negotiations do you think the idea of a peace settlement became a lost cause? So, with that in mind, let's have a look at what might one day be referred to as the very short-lived Russia-Ukraine peace process. starting with the initial talks. The first round of talks took place on February 28th, just 4 days after the invasion. The meetings took place in Belarus, and like most of the talks that took place early in the war, both sides only sent in low-ranking delegations who didn't have any real power. In many cases, they didn't even have direct lines to their respective presidents. At this point, Putin was still expecting the invasion to be fairly quick, and his demands were unconditional. He wanted the recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, the demilitarizing and denazification of the Ukrainian state, and the guarantee of Ukrainian neutrality. Naturally, the Ukrainians decided that these terms were batshit. Point 2 was almost definitely interpreted as a call for regime change, and kind of an ironic one given that it was made only a few days before Russian forces struck a Holocaust memorial site. But in any case, the negotiations concluded with no result. They were quickly followed by a second round which took place at the border between Poland and Belarus. Here, the Russians reiterated their initial demands and also added that they wanted Ukraine to grant independence to the separatist-controlled areas in the Donbass. By this time, Russia had already started denying claims that they were targeting civilian infrastructure, as footage came out of rockets hitting apartment buildings as well as kindergartens, a hospital, and a school. The talks ended on the 3rd of March with no resolution, but with one silver lining that there were discussions of a possible ceasefire to open humanitarian corridors and evacuate civilians. On the 5th of March, the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett held meetings with Putin, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and then later Zelensky, who asked him to be the mediator between both sides. He would also be in contact with Macron and the leaders in Turkey. Now, Bennett does have a slightly strange role in this whole thing. You might have noticed Marianne mentioning him in that clip, so just keep him in mind. For now, we don't know exactly what was said in these talks, but Bennett did say that both sides wanted a ceasefire and that he thought the odds of this happening were about 50-50. More on that later. At this time, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had also made another demand, this time calling for a guarantee that Western sanctions wouldn't affect Russia's trade with Iran. This demand was made only a few days before Iran was set to return to the 2015 nuclear deal, which... Okay, I won't get into it in detail here, but from the perspective of an Israeli Prime Minister, this is what you would maybe call a sus move. But more importantly, as Bennett was having these talks, stories were emerging of civilians being shot in the streets by occupying soldiers in the city of Bucha. On March 7th, the mayor of Bucha said the city was being shelled so hard that they couldn't gather up the bodies, which he said were being pulled apart by dogs in the street. And given that one of these stories was of 2 families being killed as they were attempting to flee, it's easy to see why people were becoming a bit wary of the idea that Russia would hold up their end of a humanitarian ceasefire. But despite the stories coming out of Bucha, both sides persisted with talks. On March 10th, Lavrov and Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba met in Turkey for the first meeting between high-ranking officials since the invasion began. At this point, it was reported that Russia had bombed a children's hospital in Mariupol, where 3 people, including 1 child, had died. The city, which was under siege at that time, had been described as the worst humanitarian situation in the country, with residents being trapped in the freezing cold with no electricity or water. Meanwhile, Lavrov stuck to his original demands, said that his country's military operation was going to plan, and accused the West of fueling the conflict by supplying weapons to Ukraine. Kuleba described Lavrov's terms as tantamount to a surrender, but still proposed a 24-hour humanitarian ceasefire, which Russia ignored. And if you've been to this channel before, just 1 day after these talks, the Russian ambassador went to the UN with some printouts of publicly available research about bat parasites and accused Ukraine and the United States of operating a secret bioweapons program close to the Russian border. On March 14th, they entered a 4th round of negotiations, which this time Zelensky claimed were sounding more realistic. As per, Russia demanded the same, but this time there was one development: that Zelensky appeared to concede that Ukraine would never join NATO. With this, the 15-point draft that Hasan is referring to surfaced on March 16th. It involved Kiev renouncing their ambitions to join NATO and a promise that Ukraine would not host foreign military bases or weaponry. Naftali Bennett was to be the primary international mediator, but some Ukrainian officials were already expressing doubt. When briefed on the talks, one Ukrainian source said, "There's a likelihood this is trickery and illusion. They lie about everything. Crimea, the buildup of troops on the border, and the hysteria over the invasion. We need to put pressure on them until they have no other choice but to agree to a peace deal." You might have noticed that sounds a bit similar to another quote we've heard, but don't worry about that. As these talks were taking place, Russia had been shelling Ukrainian cities for 3 consecutive nights, and Kiev announced that they were launching a counteroffensive. On the day the 15-point plan went public, officials in Mariupol announced that Russia had bombed a theater where hundreds of civilians were taking shelter, and where they had written the word children on the ground in a way that would be visible to attackers. The next day, as rescue workers were digging survivors out of the rubble, a Kremlin spokesman said they were putting in colossal effort and accused the Ukrainians of not showing much zeal towards ending the war. Fuck's sake. Likewise, the government in Ukraine said they wouldn't surrender or accept Russian ultimatums. Once again, no resolutions were reached. And that same day, the French foreign minister accused the Russians of making maximalist demands, engaging in talks with no objective other than pretending that they're negotiating, and likening their behavior to previous actions in Chechnya and Syria. So at this point, we already have dissenting voices in Kiev and France, and they would also be joined by the Estonian Prime Minister when the peace talks were renewed on March 29th. However, ahead of the meeting in Turkey, Erdogan said Ukraine was ready to compromise on 4 out of Russia's 6 demands. They had offered to renounce NATO membership and seek a collective defense clause outside of the alliance, to recognize Russian as a second official language. They didn't offer recognition of the Donbass, but Zelensky did propose a 15-year consultation period on the status of Crimea, which would come into force after a complete ceasefire. In response, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced a reduction of military activity, in other words, not a ceasefire, and only on 2 fronts, Kyiv and Chernihiv. So, assuming you still think there's any reasonable hope for a peace deal at this point, let's skip a few stages and enter Boris Johnson. So, on April 9th, Boris Johnson made a visit to Ukraine where he allegedly made this statement we read out earlier. And I say allegedly because, as far as I can tell, this quote is not direct. According to the original source, the quote is paraphrased from one of Zelensky's close associates, but outside of that, there's no context or any way of confirming it. The transcript of Boris's speech from that day is publicly available on the UK government website, where he says nothing of the sort. In fact, this is probably one of the most nothing burger "we support you guys" speech anyone could think of giving. He talks about keeping up sanctions on Russia, liberalizing trade with Ukraine. He quotes Heraclitus because it's a Boris Johnson speech. The conference was also uploaded to YouTube on the same day, so you can have a peep there too if you want. Now, maybe this statement was given behind closed doors, but I just want to be clear that if the claim is as bold as Boris Johnson ended what would have otherwise been a promising negotiation, this is the evidence we're dealing with. This and one quote from Bennett, who would later tell an interviewer that there was a good chance of reaching a ceasefire had they not curbed it. They presumably referring to Ukraine's Western backers. These are the 2 statements that were seized upon by the likes of Aaron Mate, this Jacobin writer, I guess Hasan, and no doubt many others. The problem is, this claim doesn't add up even if we assume that the quote from Boris is real. If you look at this transcript from April 9th, you'll notice he mentions Bucha and then talks about how Putin's retreat is tactical and he's going to intensify pressure now in the Donbass and in the east. Why does this matter? Well, because on April 1st, just over 1 week before Boris's visit, the Russians withdrew from Bucha, allowing the Ukrainians to re-enter the city where they finally confirmed what had previously only come out in drabs. That the Russian army had left the streets littered with the bodies of mutilated men, women, and children in what seems to have been the worst war crime in Europe since the Yugoslav wars. Even if this quote from Boris is accurate, you could argue that this is nothing more than a confirmation of what several people on the Ukrainian side already believed. That the idea of negotiating with the Kremlin in good faith after these revelations was a lost cause. And those are not just my words. If we come back to the Pravda article, which put out the original claim about Boris, they describe the Prime Minister's visit as the second obstacle to agreements. The first one they mention, which I would argue seems to be the much bigger one, was the exposure of atrocities, rapes, murders, massacres, looting, indiscriminate bombings, and hundreds and thousands of other war crimes committed by Russian troops on temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories. How and what can you talk to Putin about if you don't talk to him about Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, or Azovstal? The moral and value gulf between Putin and the world is so great that even in the Kremlin, there will not be such a large negotiating table to close it. I guess that's a reference to the size of the tables in the Kremlin. Anyway, this also happens to have been the opinion of Naftali Bennett, who has since come out to clarify that he was unsure there was any deal to be made. If you're wondering why Twitter, which now begins with a silent X apparently, flagged Mate's tweet arguing that it misrepresented the original statements, it might be because none of these wallopers cared to mention this part from Bennett's interview where he quite clearly states, "The Bucha massacre. Once that happened, I said it's over." In other words, what Bennett actually said was that the hopes of achieving a peace settlement were killed here, just over a week before Boris arrived. So this quote, if it is accurate, is simply him affirming what people in Ukraine already believed. And if that's still not enough, 2 days before Boris's visit, the Ukrainian draft peace deal was dismissed by Lavrov as unacceptable, whilst the Kremlin accused the West of trying to derail negotiations by raising war crime allegations against Russian troops. So, coming back to Hasan's claim, Boris Johnson couldn't have halted a peace deal because the Kremlin never wanted a peace deal. What they wanted from the beginning of the invasion up until this point was a surrender. And that only gets worse when you look at how they continue to behave throughout the year. As I was looking for the origins of that Boris claim, I did find one speech where he definitely did warn against peace negotiations, only this was several months later on September 22nd. And by this point, Lavrov had already told the Russian state media that Ukraine's offer to compromise over NATO was no longer an option. In fact, he even said giving Russia all of the Donbass was not enough, and that they also wanted recognition for Kherson and Zaporizhia, which Russia formally annexed later that year. And I should also throw in, just for the hell of it, that after Boris's visit, Lavrov was asked how Russia was denazifying Ukraine given that they had elected a Jewish president. His response was to say, "I could be wrong, but Hitler also had Jewish blood." Wise Jewish people say that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. I love it how he said he could be wrong. He is, by the way. That's complete bullshit. Yeah. Anyway, Hasan. I've spoken before about the idea of left-wing Western exceptionalism, but if you're going to argue that there was a peace deal which both sides could have been happy with and that it fell apart because Boris Johnson, this person, had the power to kill that deal, and your only evidence is one out-of-context quote from a person who claims this is what they heard Boris say, it's just a bit... what the f***? Also, while we're at it, Aaron Mate is a massive propagandist hack. This Jacobin guy, everything he writes about Ukraine is absolute horseshit. Hasan, mate, you're giving these takes to a potential future president of the United States. I mean, okay, I know she's not actually going to win, but still, f*** me.
I think some people talk very simplistically.
Yeah.